Welcome to Teaching That Counts, a podcast dedicated to the teaching and learning of mathematics. I'm your host, Abel Maestas, and I love to talk about math education. Together with my amazing guests, we'll explore several topics in the world of math teaching and student learning. Whether it's building thinking classrooms, healing math trauma, building student and teacher math confidence, or creating more equitable math workspaces. If it's going to help students learn math and teachers teach math, then we'll talk about it. So if you're a teacher, a parent like me, admin, or a coach like me, I hope you find something that can inspire you and help build your practice listening to this podcast. You can always find us online at www.teachingthatcountspodcast.com. Yeah, I know that's long, but hey, that's the URL. You can find me on YouTube at Maestas Math or on socials at Maestas Teach. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to this month's podcast of Teaching That Counts. I'm so excited, as always, to have you listen to this podcast. I have a very special guest that really looks into looking at how we're going to teach students in mathematics in the future, but looking at future impacts on students and why it's so important to think about how we're teaching students now for 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line when they're in their careers, when they're living in our world, right? So my guest this month is SL Rao, who is a strategist that creates new futures in education, health, and climate through design and inspired system transformation. They bring a system-oriented, equity-centered approach to their work and how they build, nurture, and grow teams and organizations. SL is curious and driven by the need really to find solutions to seemingly intractable problems. In the last few years, SL has extended their work to include building inclusive and diverse teams by developing a strong culture of feedback, appreciation, transparency, and collectivism. SL combines their engineering and tinkering background with their professional experience in theater to solve problems in different spheres. They thrive in interdisciplinary, innovative, liminal spaces where they build bridges that facilitate co-creating more equity-centered products, services, and policies. Bringing a strong multicultural lens to their work that has been shaped by living and working across different continents. SL also brings the drive to shift research, decision-making, and design power to lived experts, those who are most impacted by systems and systemic changes. In our case, in our discussion, it's students. So we have a great conversation about changing those structures that are in math systems, like in our systems, in our schools, so that we can reach all students in increasing their mathematical abilities. SL also has a background in integrating technology in math classes, so we talk a little bit about integrating some tech into math for equity, the importance of relevance to students and student engagement, and why that is so important in keeping students not only engaged, but understanding why they're going to be using mathematics in the future. And then the bulk of our conversation revolves around creating what SL calls a liberatory math future, and really looking at the impacts of future elements on students, modernizing that mathematics. You can get this on modernizingmath.com. And if we back up, we kind of back out a little bit more and think of it, instead of a teaching lens, the end of this podcast is really great for educational leaders, school board members like myself, who's also a school board member, anybody that's involved in looking at changing the structures and the systems that are built around our school systems, and what particular systems need to be in place for students to feel empowered in their future in mathematics. So really fascinating conversation, especially for those administrators and lead educational leaders that have big impacts on structures as well as teachers, because we do talk about how we can impact those things in the beginning of our conversation. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with SL Rao. All right, welcome everybody to the podcast this month, Teaching That Counts. I'm so excited for you all to join us this month. I have a great guest. I'm so interested in talking about some of the work that they've been doing. So I'd like to welcome to the podcast SL Rao.
Thank you so much for having me here, Abel. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to share some of the work we've been doing. And yeah, really appreciate this time.
Cool. So I know that you do a lot of work with technology, integrating technology
Yes.
with mathematics, with equitable spaces, which is something that we're all about here on Teaching the Counts,
Yeah.
and I've been working on that in my own work too. And I really want you just to give just a quick synopsis of what your work has been,
Yeah.
what you've been working on, and what we can start talking about here on the podcast.
Yeah, sounds great. So I'll provide a little bit of context. I work for a small design consulting firm where we are focused on equity-centered design and research. What that means is we do deep ethnographic research, both qualitative and quantitative, specifically focused on in the education sector, but in the social impact sector as a whole. But when you think about the education sector or any sector, we tend to focus on communities, individuals, students who are currently underserved by the existing systems or services. So really to understand taking an asset-based lens, and we'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that,
Yeah.
on the expertise that existing communities of color, disabled communities, um, in the same way students of color, maybe ELL students bring to the table, and to better understand how their experiences, behaviors might be impacted by the larger system as a whole. So when we say an equity centered design approach, our approach is drawn from a practice that was developed or a process that was developed by the National Equity Institute. National Equity Project. But however, one of the things that we have kind of done from there is really thinking about it also from a systemic perspective, because a lot of research tends to focus on the individuals and their behaviors and tries to isolate that. But really, we recognize there are larger structures in play that influence and motivate us. And so another part of our process is we not only work in the research pieces, we help partners, organizations, educational institutions also think about interventions. So that those could be technology, so designing the actual technology, doing the user experience, or if it's a service, really thinking about how you can design something end to end. We're a pretty small design firm. We're about 6 people, and
Wow.
we have a few researchers, and so we spend a lot of our time in this like space of really trying to understand um, how we behave as human beings, what influences us, but also specifically like what are existing societal structures, biases, mindsets that continue to perpetuate certain patterns that are continue to cause harm, like deep harm, where people's lives are impacted, or have impacts on communities, on student learning, and things like that.
Yeah. That's wonderful work. Small but mighty, right? Even a small group like that can make acting impactful change, and that's what we really need well, especially in math education.
Yes.
So we in here in California, so I work here in California, and in California we've adopted a new mathematics framework.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've been looking at and learning about the framework is we talk a lot about equitable, engaging math instruction, and this
Mm-hmm.
idea of um, being able to reach all kids, like knowing that all
Yes.
kids can do math at a high level.
Yes.
But there's this, I think, for many times there's this sense. I was talking to a teacher the other day, and they were mentioning how, like, well, this, the way I learned, like, it really worked for me, and I know there's
Yeah.
some kids that it worked for me. And I explained, I said, well, a lot of times we're the exception,
Yeah.
not the rule.
Yeah.
the
Also,
system in place, right?
there's also shame in saying that that didn't work, right? We
Mm,
probably struggled, but when you look back at it, because we're successful now, there's a perspective of like, there's shame in like not being able to fit within the existing system, right? There's probably a lot of feedback we received either from caregivers and parents and the adults and maybe our peers, and so now we look back and it's like, yeah, it worked, but we might have been struggling. We might still look at it from a different perspective. But you bring up a really good point, is like, we might be the exception, we might be masking that it didn't work
yeah, I
because we
didn't
didn't
even
have
think
another
about
option.
that. Yeah, I didn't
Yeah,
even think about how it may not have worked, and we persevered through
that's
that.
exactly what it is.
Like I hadn't even thought of that as that perspective. Like, oh
Yeah,
yeah, it worked for me, but maybe it wasn't that it was working. Maybe I worked through the system.
that's exactly what it is. Like, some of us might be better at working within the system. And maybe
Mm,
and that doesn't necessarily mean we're better than other people. It's just that, like you were saying, maybe the system was essentially designed for us,
yeah.
our ways of thinking or seeing the world, and so we can work within it. But that doesn't mean that it worked for us, and that doesn't necessarily mean that if we had seen another option or opportunity, that might have worked better. Might have been less effort, right?
Yeah, well, I didn't even think of that perspective. And it's funny is now having been in the spaces where I'm at now, I think back to my own experience in mathematics, and
Yeah,
I wish that I had that experience that
yeah,
I'm trying to have for my own kids,
yeah,
my own
yeah.
students. And I hadn't even thought about that perspective, and that, like, what if like we what if a lot. What if the system was different?
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I heard, maybe it was Joe Bowler who was talking in the podcast where, you know, sometimes parents and teachers are afraid of change
Mm,
because it means something completely different. But it also, in some ways, it could for them feel like, oh, but it not just that it worked for me, so it should work for other people. If there are other ways of doing things, then what does it mean for how I navigated the world, right? We're basically like almost dismantling people's realities, and we have to sometimes be cognizant of that
right.
when we're suggesting change, especially when it's like, when we, even I grew up with like math. Math is neutral. Math is there's only yes or right answers. It is, black or white. Like, there's only one way of doing it. But I was able to work through that. And I succeeded within that specific system because I think I was forced to memorize things. Like, I hacked the system in a certain way that is not actually necessarily set me up for success over a longer period of time. I also, um, another person on your podcast, I think it was Dr. Bowler actually, who also talked about like math-ish, right? Like, that's how I do math now. If
Yeah.
I had just learned that earlier,
Yeah, I
it would
know.
have wasted such little, so much time trying to like memorize and like trying to get up to speed because I didn't feel like I was good enough to be able to do math in the ways that was necessary for me. And I carried those perspectives for a long time. It's like, I'm smart because I can do math. I'm also because I can do the correct answer, but not
Hmm.
necessarily can I actually think through critically why this could be correct or why this could be wrong,
Right.
or what other places can I apply this, right? Like, that is what we want students to leave with, not necessarily like, oh, I was able to solve this very specific problem in this very specific context that I'm never ever going to see again, right?
Yes. Yes. I was talking to a few teachers today, and I was like, they were talking about how to, the mathematics being more relevant and culturally relevant, and then when it is relevant, it's engaging. And what does that
Yeah,
relevance mean? And the teacher was saying, a student would ask like, where am I going to use this? Why am I going to use this? And
exactly.
and I said, that's probably factoring. Like, who uses factoring? We started talking. Who uses factoring? Really, really, who uses factoring? And they were like, well, maybe if they go into science and medical. I'm like, really? Tell me where a physician's using factoring. Like, it's very specific places where you
Yep,
might use it,
yep,
and so I can see the student's sense of like, why am I doing this?
yep,
Where is this going to impact my world? And then the teacher says,
exactly.
well, when we're they do use a lot of quadratics. Maybe when they're modeling stuff, I said, yes, exactly. When we're modeling, but where is factoring in that? Like,
Yeah.
what is the math that we're really looking towards? And it's got me thinking about. Now, I was talk meeting with somebody. It's got me thinking about, am I going to use this in 20 years? Like,
Right.
will this
Yeah.
be impactful for me in 20 years? And I
That's
know
exactly
that
right.
you've been doing some work in um, creating I think you called it liberatory math future or something
Yeah.
like that. And so I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about that, about
Yeah.
your work in thinking about what are those things that will impact students' futures, and
Yes.
what can we be doing now in terms of both the structures that we have in the systems of
Yeah.
our schools, but also
Hmm.
on a teacher lens, like what can I be doing as a
Yeah.
teacher or a
Yeah.
coach or a leader to help get these kids prepared for those things that are going to impact them on their day-to-day lives in 20
Yep.
years.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I will say a lot, all our work we do with students, teachers, and caregivers. I kind of mentioned that equity centered
Mm,
approach.
uh-huh.
And so the other mindset that we take is like, how do we not just do extractive research? So we're not just going into school, taking information, and then interpreting it ourselves, right?
Right.
So part of when we talk about the work that we've done in kind of the futures thinking, kind of thinking about what could math education look like 20 years out, 30 years out, what we wanted to do is we wanted to really hear and design this with students, with caregivers and educators, because a lot of times when things are implemented, the teacher in the classroom doesn't always have a say, the student doesn't always have a say, and the caregivers are kind of left out of it, right? And then the other focus is trying to again focus on students from communities that are underserved, versus looking at the average student, because we don't have an average student. That is a lie, right? Like
Right.
we're told there's an average student, there's an average body size, there's an average hair color, but we know we're all different, and yes, there might be some similarities. So how do we focus on students whose voices are not heard and use that and create a space where they can dream up what the future can look like? And so we also wanted to make sure that they had the tools to be able to make those decisions, right? So we worked with another, so this work was funded by the Gates Foundation, and we partnered with another organization called Knowledge Works. Their focus was really around like future trends mapping. So we wanted to know, like, if we think about today, we have a present bias, right? Like we think about today, we look at the world around and we say, okay, what is important today? We'll get really stuck in the structures that exist today. If you ask her, or anybody, like if I ask you what you want today, our imaginations are constrained by what is possible within the constraints of today. But we really wanted people to be able to think out into the future. So we wanted to see societally, education wise, health, economics, like what are the trends we're seeing based on what's happening right now. We
Mm,
also know there's an environmental crisis happening,
yes.
there's economic ups and downs, and there's a huge technological boost right now, which is going to change a lot of what will happen in the next 20 years, right? And so using those trends, really using those as a place for students to say, okay, now if you could dream what math education could look like, what would it look like for you? And so from there, what we did, we used those imaginations, we documented them, and then we worked with subject matter experts to say, this is what students want to see. What are the clear, specific directives, that steps that teachers, education, people who fund education, districts, governments, what can they do to make sure that these preferences come to the fore? And so that's kind of like the background of what this work is about, how it was put together. And people can find it at modernizingmath.com online.
Mm-hmm.
So it has the full report, it has a process, but the work really culminated in identifying that there's three major areas that students are really, like, students, teachers, and caregivers, they were like actually validated in a lot of ways, right? One are they all kind of came into these three massive group, I would say, intersecting like insights of like where people want education to go. One is really focused on thinking about the kind of shifting power or balancing power between teachers and students. Because
Mm,
right now, teachers are like the knowledge holders, and a lot of times the ways in which the way I experience,
Yeah.
math and STEM education was there's one person up there and they know everything. They're going to tell me. They're going to fill my cup, and it's just
Right.
going to sit here in my cup up here, and then I'll figure out how to apply this later. But really think about balancing that power includes like helping teachers create knowledge with students in the classroom, because we as teachers, we are not going to know what else is within the student context, what else is going to come up. But what we want to do is, one, create a space where they can be active participants. They can tell us what they want within that classroom environment, what else they need to be learning. We're also understanding what context that they're experiencing and learning together. So it's okay to make meaning together. I think there's this perception that math, everything that is mathematical has been studied and done, and that's it, right? There's no more
There's
math
no more
knowledge.
math out there,
There's
right?
no more math out there.
Yeah.
But really, like, students should be part of the knowledge making around mathematical thinking, because that's what we're trying
Hmm.
to do. And as educators, we don't need to know every single thing. It's like we're learning together, right? The other one is around like uh, the thinking about the walls of the classroom. Right now, learning happens within the constraints of a classroom. How do we connect this to actual work that students might be doing, right? Even now, we don't know 20 years out what other new job opportunities are going to come out. But starting early, are there ways in which students are learning in context? This could include like apprenticeships, like ways to connect with people actually using this math, right? And doing and learning early and soon. And this is what a lot of students were interested in, because they don't want to just focus on the math that they're learning right now. They're like, how does cryptocurrency work? Like, how are all of the things that I'm interacting with in this world work, and what knowledge would I need so that I can make these decisions? Students might need to find their own ways of like make their own like path to jobs, and we need to give them the knowledge to be able to do that, right? And then the other one is around kind of the interdisciplinary relevancy. So it's kind of related to the between like the walls of the classroom, like taking learning outside is also, how do we make this knowledge relevant? And you kind of brought this up, right? Like, how do we make math more relevant? Are there ways that it's embedded within other subjects that they're learning? So it's less of like, you are studying math, you are studying biology. It's like, we know chemistry has a lot of math,
Yeah.
and we know, so it's like the why and the how and connecting those pieces, right? And then making sure that it's like you're learning more holistically and not isolated. And that's what really resonated for students, and really being embedded in the environment that they're in, and really learning through like applied learning. It's like, oh, I'm going to be working with, the things that are going to be important are, if we're thinking about the climate, like clean energy, we're looking at solar panels, we're looking at the earth, we're trying to grow things. How is the math that I'm learning and the chemistry and the biology going to help me overall, right? So those were some of the main things that kind of came up. I'll pause here and see if there's some questions, because there are some, when we think about a liberatory math future, there are some like underlying factors that need to exist that is outside of maybe the control of the teachers, outside the control of the students, but they need to exist. And I want to talk a little bit about that if that's of interest as well. But those are considerations for funders, for education districts, for governments, as governments shift and change and their priorities change, and what they focus on varies so much. We start recognizing that is going to shift the way students are going to come into the classroom, how they're going to experience knowledge, how they're able to interact with it. Here in some of this, when we're thinking about these recommendations, we were like, hey, here's some foundational things that need to exist for students to feel and be in a space where they can engage in math and mathematical thinking or scientific thinking in a way that is empowering them to engage and make the most of their future.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that because,
Yeah.
but I do have a couple of questions or questions, comments from previous. You mentioned that the teachers co-creating, right,
Yes.
facilitating. I know that same thing. It was like, the teacher is the person with all
Yep.
the knowledge, but when I was talking to Peter Liljedahl, he likes to say the smartest person in the room is the room, and it's not. We have to move away from being the owner of all the knowledge. I just did
Mm-hmm.
a a learning lab with NCSM where I
Mm-hmm.
focused on leveraging student thinking. And if you
Yes.
leverage student thinking, the students are the drivers of the mathematics, and I'm the
Mm-hmm.
facilitator of bringing it together so that they can see how their thinking connects to the mathematics that we want them to learn. Then it gives them more ownership, more agency for all of that. But here is the thing. I was talking again, I talked to a lot of teachers. A teacher
Mm-hmm.
today about this, like, oh, this is, the teacher was saying, this is great. I understand problem based and task based mathematics. I get how that, but the issue that we're having is that sometimes the reluctant teachers that have done things the one way their whole careers don't have the supports that they
Yeah.
need
Yep.
to implement because of the thing that you brought up. And
Yeah.
it's that it's scary to
Yeah.
not know what the
Exactly.
students are going to say, and then to
Mm-hmm.
be able to use that to drive the learning in a way that you are
Mm-hmm.
trying to get to the standards or the big ideas or whatever
Yeah.
content that you're trying to get to. Doing it the traditional way, I know exactly where
Mm-hmm.
I'm going. I know
Yep.
what the students are going. I can drive that bus.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm a passenger trying to
So much
navigate,
harder.
now I'm basically the
Yes.
navigator of that bus
Yep.
now. That's harder because I don't know where the turns are going to go.
Exactly.
And so that's the piece that I know that teachers are a little
Yeah.
apprehensive when we're trying to move forward.
And it's also scary in ways like exactly what you were saying. Like, you're now the navigator. You have to know how to intervene and like you need to maybe know a little bit but also be okay with not knowing everything, and that's a difficult place to be. And we also know from research and all the information that's out there in many states and counties, or school districts, when it comes to elementary school teachers, because there is no mathematics focus, there is some, like, I don't want to say reluctance, but like fear and anxiety. So teachers are already bringing their own anxieties into this, feeling like, oh, but I'm so much better at arts and humanities, and like I also have to teach math. And I didn't do well in math. I'm not, like the math identity of like I'm not a math person. Um, and then having that person now be okay with giving up a little bit of that power to say like, okay, how do I facilitate? It is a different skill, right? Like we do a lot of facilitation of workshops, and it needs a different type of coaching. It needs a little bit shift of the mindset. So all of this comes with this mindset shift of what can teachers do in the classrooms is like if we're saying where we want to balance power, we need to be able to have a space where teachers are able to take feedback and the school systems are able to take feedback, right? Like that's not necessarily a thing that happens with a student perspective, because I think our entire society as a whole has a like adultism lens, right? Like we tend to
Right.
defer to the adults in the
Yeah.
system, and students are smart. They're really engaged. They're a lot of times they're engaged in so many more things than we are, but we don't give them outlets to give us feedback. And it's not and they're not necessarily supported also to give feedback in a way, in a meaningful way. So once it's escalated to a certain extent, it becomes an issue. So being able to take feedback, be able to see all students from an asset-based perspective, right? Like that is also a mindset shift. And really thinking about this is not necessarily like it's not necessarily a flaw in this. There's this binary thinking, like I do this too, right?
Right.
Like it's taken a lot of like undoing, is like, if I'm not doing this correctly, I'm wrong. So we tend to have a deficit mindset when we look inward,
Right.
to ourselves. It's like we're constantly comparing or seeing what we did wrong. So taking that asset-based perspective also applies to ourselves, like applies to the teachers. What is the teacher doing correctly? Like what's working? And feedback is actually a gift. Like it can help me do better, and it doesn't have to come from the adult. It can come from students. Um, and then taking kind of a systematic lens, because that also allows teachers to see the larger system at play. So you're not saying that, um, not necessarily attributing so if the discussion goes in a certain direction, right, you're not necessarily attributing it to our societal biases that we have, no matter what we do, however how well read we are, there are going to be underlying biases that are going to show.
Right.
So really recognizing, like, constantly keeping that in the back of our mind and having that systems lens of like what else might be influencing the ways in which we're thinking, and what might be influencing the ways in which we might be seeing the student, and how, we might see a student as like, when they're giving us feedback, as being maybe non-compliant or something like that. So these are, you know, things that are longer term systemic shifts, right? Like they're not going to happen tomorrow. To get a teacher from moving from a practice where they are at the front of stage, talking, teaching, guiding, to being a co-navigator with the students, that is a massive shift, and that requires a lot of like intermediate, like pedagogical shifts. It needs supports, it needs mindset shifts, and a lot of, we can get there if we start moving from a mindset shift perspective. Like as educators in the classroom, like there are steps that we can take to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's get into some of these systemic things, system-wide things that
Yeah.
you had mentioned. And I don't normally do this on this podcast because I try to take my I try to take this podcast is very, this podcast is really about math teaching, math
Yeah.
coaching, math learning, math education.
Yeah.
And some listeners out there know that I am a school board member. I was just elected to my second term. The first term
Mm-hmm.
I was didn't run against anybody. This time I was duly elected, and I have a little bit of um, I'm not going to say there's any power, but I have the ability to look at the system and
Mm-hmm.
possibly thinking about change, right? If needed.
Mm-hmm.
And we have been working hard on our equity lens. Like we have
Mm-hmm.
a lot of socioeconomic, low socioeconomic
Mm-hmm.
population in our
Yeah.
in our city. We have homeless students. We have a lot of English language learners, multilingual
Mm-hmm.
learners. We have students of just varied across our huge city. And one of the things I ran on particularly was that my belief that a better education will create a better community. And
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah.
there are structures that I know that teachers can't, they can't necessarily
Yeah.
change that in their classroom. But
Yes.
there are
Yeah.
structures that, as I work as a board member towards
Mm.
creating a more equitable educational space for all of the students that
Yes.
represent in this city that
Yeah.
I'm in. What are the things that we can do as like leaders in a bigger sense? Those foundational things that you said have to
Yeah.
happen so that we can start to move and make the change that we want and see all
Yeah.
kids succeed at the levels that we know all kids can.
Yeah. There's a laundry list, but I will.
Yeah, I know. I just asked you a
And
huge question. So,
there's probably, there's going to be things that I don't cover just because there's just a lot. And you are probably aware of that, but there's like four fundamental things that we've called out, just because those were things that we recognize are extremely important. And with the perspective of focusing it on math and, education, and full participation of
hmm
students.
hmm
And these were also based on like what caregivers and educators brought up as like things that need to align, right? Like one is, you kind of brought up socioeconomic status and those kinds of things. We know the impact of trauma and poverty and hunger on learning. So one of the things is like, and also the stress on parents to make ends meet. It also reduces their ability to be able to fully support their students in some cases, right? I'm not saying every person impacted by poverty is working multiple jobs, but really thinking about what are ways in which we need to be in a society where we're meeting basic needs of people. This includes like access to job opportunities, healthcare, disability support, right, and food for students. And I know we have some of those supports, and during the pandemic, a lot of school districts did a lot of things to be able to get food to students when they're not inside a
hmm
school building,
yeah,
which is amazing. And I think that's, we need to continue to do that. And I think as things change, like we're seeing changes in our political system, that some of these really important things that help students learn are lost because they're like, oh, learning is like neutral. It just happens in a classroom. It's like, no, you cannot learn when you're hungry. You cannot
no,
learn when you're traumatized by poverty, right? So we're assuming in this future we have these basic things met so that all students can come and perform and experience education in a way that is meaningful to them. The other thing is like, um, this one is going to be hard, but really recognizing that for a lot of communities, the education system in the US has been set up in a specific way, right? Like we know the education was segregated. We also know the history of residential schools in the United States. So the ways in which the US government continued to marginalize indigenous students, right?
Right.
The focus on education was to westernize and to remove culture. And so now we're backfilling and saying, let us make it more culturally relevant, make it more helpful. But also, that's also part of it is where the school systems were integrated, but Black teachers were not integrated, right? Like
Mm.
students had
Yeah.
access to culturally supportive environments, but we stripped it out,
But the
right?
staff
So,
wasn't.
yes,
That's yeah, I wasn't even thinking about that. Yeah, you're right. The students were integrated, but staff weren't. Mm.
yes. So it comes to this piece of like, we need to see and like recognize and acknowledge the foundations on which students are learning right now. And for a lot of students, classrooms and schools are a place of oppression because they are going through metal detectors. They're being harassed for being poor, right? Or experiencing poverty.
Mm.
And so some of the students who talked about it is like, that's part of like wanting learning doesn't happen when you're in that oppressive environment, when your classroom feels like a cage, right? And so what are ways in which we also know a lot of times, we've seen data that shows that when technology is implemented, for example, in a classroom, in privileged classrooms, private schools, predominantly white, schools, um, students are using technology for creativity. In Black, Brown, and Title I schools, the technology is being implemented, potentially the same technology is being implemented as remedial, kind of repetitive tasks. So you're telling one group of students that they can be imaginative, and the other group that you're wrong. You just need to practice, right? And so thinking about these are kind of underlying mindsets that we have, and we really need to be undoing those. And then the other thing is like obviously resourcing. We know there's a resourcing issue across the country in schools. Uh, Teachers should want to come and teach and be
Yeah.
rewarded for all the amazing work that they're doing,
Right.
right? There's so much other countries have, when you think about being an educator, like that's highly prized in many countries because you're basically teaching the next generation of your country. And, we don't necessarily have that everywhere here.
Mm.
And then alignment on the purpose of schooling. And I think that's a really big one is like, is the purpose of schooling to transfer existing knowledge over and over again, or is it to allow students to um, bring in critical thinking and their assets to be able to use what they're learning to put a lens on the world that they're in, right? Are we enabling them to use what they're learning within the classroom to make a change outside? Or is it like the classroom is detached? Like this is a place of, we just dump a lot of information. You figure out after you graduate what you want to do. What is the purpose of schooling? Is it just to grab all the information? Is it to critically analyze and build the mindsets that you need and the foundational like skills that you need that you can apply outside, right? I think that's a big part of like mathematical thinking. Like, what is the point of it? Is like you were saying, like, why do you need to study factorials? Actually, if you learn how to learn in school, if you don't learn factorials and you need that one, that 5% of the population of students who might need it, can you learn that when you are in a place where you need to, right? Like, are we
Yeah.
teaching them how to learn? Is that the
Right.
most important thing? Or are we actually, yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Teaching students how to learn. Because when I was talking to Peter Lildahl, he said, you remember in college, like you go to lecture to learn what you need to learn, and then
Mm-hmm.
you go and
Yeah.
learn it.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the reality of when students leave our space is, did I set them up to have the tools
That's
to
exactly right.
be agents in their own life, to be
Hmm.
change agents in their
That's
world.
exactly right. Yeah, and their community. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So we talk in our California framework. We talk about teaching towards social justice, and
Yes,
I
that's
know
exactly right.
that some teachers get a little afraid about that, like, oh, I don't want to be political. I don't, and it's not really about being political. It's about allowing students to have the tools to be agents of change in their own lives
Yeah,
and in their own communities,
yeah,
whatever impact that might be.
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I'm so excited to thank you for those key elements because I think it's really important. And I know that some of the listeners that I have, some of the listeners are board members and
yeah,
are uh, leaders in their districts, and so to hear like these are the things that we need to know exist and change.
yeah,
Yeah, are super important. I mean, that's the only way we're going to get to really building equitable spaces. We're
yeah,
so far. I mean, we're
yeah,
here a century later, and we're still trying to recover from the things that we set up.
yeah. I think that's exactly right. I think a lot of times we try to retrofit things into an existing system and it's like, it's not working. And it's like, oh no, we just need to step back and understand the history of why things are the way they are. And I think that was part of the work that we did when we think about the future. It's like, it's not enough to just dream up a future out of nowhere because we want to make sure we're not repeating mistakes of the past. So we actually ended up spending a lot of time mapping out policies and the history of the US education system as a whole and how it influenced math, how all of that didn't fit in our document because there's just
Yeah,
so much more. So there's a lot more learning. But what, the biggest things are just like really recognizing some of these pieces of like, oh yeah, we're actually trying to make a system that wasn't necessarily designed to do XYZ to try to do that, right? Like that's when it becomes hard. So I think even if people feel like they don't have the power they might be in the classroom, part of it is like building that mindset, right? Like really recognizing that everyone is coming and impacted and influenced by these systemic things. And so, what are things that we can do as educators to not reinforce those systemic pieces? And it's hard. We're all humans. We're all socialized in a specific way, and I think that's all the work that we can do, even if it is. And these are not political things. Like we're
yeah,
continuing to learn.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. SL, I am so happy that you were able to join me today on this podcast. I've learned so much and a lot to think about in terms of what are we setting up our kids for,
yeah,
and how can we make the change that we know is necessary to make just a better community, better world for our kids in the
yeah.
future. So I really appreciate your time. Before you go, and before we end this, I'd like you just to let everyone know where they can see your work, where they can contact
Yes.
you, any information you can about your work that would be great.
Definitely, yes. So the contents that I was just talking about, the Liberatory Math Futures, is available on modernizingmath.com. And it actually includes clear kind of steps and action steps that can be taken by teachers, district leaders. So we've tried to do our best to like highlight every opportunity there. So if there are leaders who are listening to this, there are steps and you can look at that and see if those fit within what you want to do. We're also at optimistic.design. That is my company's website. You can find kind of other work, our other resources that we have. We have other resources as it applies to like understanding younger students. For edtech developers, we've built toolkits to help people actually co-design, actually do this with students rather than on students. And then lastly, the people can find me on LinkedIn. It's under my full name. It's Shri Lakshmi Rao, but I don't know, Abel, if you're able to include links in the podcast notes.
Yeah,
Happy to
absolutely.
share that.
Hmm.
And if people want to connect with me there, send me a ping and let me know how you heard about me so I know to respond. But yeah, thank you so much for having me here and share some of the things that students, teachers, and caregivers shared with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know that there were so much more that we could have talked about. So I really appreciate your time. Thank
Yeah,
you, and hope to have everybody back at some point.
sounds
Thanks.
good.